In this video we'll deal with the components of the general environment. More specifically, we'll look at Porter's five forces and look at the insight that Porter's five forces give us on the competitive nature of the environment in which the business operates, and looks at some of the factors that come out of our study of the general environment which will impact on businesses. So let's start. First of all, we're going to look at the industrial and competitive environment and see what feeds in to that. See what aspects of the environment we can identify and how they will impinge upon the organization. So we're going to look at the components of the competitive environment. And we can start with the economic component. Now you see from the little box on the bottom, towards the bottom of the slide, we talk here about the economic segment, and it's made up from different components. For example, organizations must be aware of the inflation rate, because that determines what's happening in markets in terms of prices, but it could also impact on the price of raw materials, the price of services that the organization has to buy in. So it must be aware of the inflation rate and look at the projections of the inflation rate as made by, say, economists and the government over the short term, the medium term and the long term. But also bear in mind interest rates. Interest rates also impact on the organization. It may have to borrow capital from banks or from institutions, and this will incur a rate of interest. And if the secular rate of interest, if the long run rate of interest is on the up, if it's increasing, then this will mean greater charges against the profits of the business. So the organization must also be aware of interest rates. Trade deficits and surpluses may be of interest. If there's a deficit, for example, on the balance of payments, then the value of the currency will fall in international markets. However, a falling currency can lead to greater competitiveness, because as the currency falls, it becomes more competitive overseas. So in other words, in the case of the UK, for example, if the pound falls in value, then UK exports become cheaper. Now that will help the exporting industries. And also imports will become more expensive if the pound falls in value. So imports will become more expensive, which means perhaps domestic consumers will switch over to buying British produced goods and services. So we can see that the balance of payments is also important, as indeed are budget deficits and surpluses. For example, the government may run a deficit on its account, but at some stage it will have to pay the deficits. The national debt will increase and may become a significant burden on governments. So it may have to raise funds in the future to repay its debts. Now that will have an impact on spending power within the economy. There are other factors which need to be considered as well, which I'll put on the right hand side. Personal savings, how much people want to save, will affect the competitive environment. If people are predisposed to save a significant part of their income, then there will be less expenditure in the economy, which could be bad for industrial growth, for sales and for employment. Business saving rates could also influence these factors. And indeed, just look at the pattern for the gross domestic product. Look at what's happening to output in the country over a period of time. Is the country growing or is it declining? If the country is growing, there may be opportunities for more sales. So industrialists must look at the competitive environment and isolate out various economic factors and look at economic trends and try to understand the underlying determinants of those trends to try and work out what is the best course of action for them. There's also a socio-cultural component to the competitive environment. All sorts of issues here. Women at work, for example. Women are an extremely valuable part of the workforce. Probably the most important part of the workforce. They have high skill levels, high rates of application to their careers and to their jobs. Very valuable component in the labour market. And yet, of course, women face a lot of problems in getting jobs, maybe because of discrimination, or in holding down the jobs because of family commitments. But certainly there's an issue about trying to get the engagement of more women into the workforce, because they are quite a valuable component within the workforce. They make a good contribution. And looking at the diversity of the workforce, looking at ethnic diversity as well, looking at people from different backgrounds, this can improve industrial organisation and productivity. Sometimes people come in from different backgrounds, perhaps with different ideas, different mindsets, and are able to bring ideas in front of the management that perhaps would otherwise have been missed. But diversity in the workforce is seen as desirable in itself, because it simply creates a more dynamic, more interesting, a more vibrant place of work, and there should be more motivation for people to work in those environments. There's also issues about the work-life quality. There are all sorts of debates about how much work we should have, and what's the split between leisure and work. In some occupations, for example in medicine, doctors seem to work very long hours. Some doctors work 80 hours a week or 90 hours a week, or even, let's say, they just work 60 hours a week. That's a significant proportion of their life. Now, other people, perhaps in other professions, would want to work maybe 30 hours a week. There's a big difference in those rates of application, and that's significant. It depends on what are the norms within different industries, I suppose, within different sectors. But there are also issues on the other side, wider issues about, for example, the environment. Society is concerned with issues about the environment, and it's important that industry address those concerns. So it is more it's careful about how it produces and how it presents its products, and recycling and production with appropriate technologies which will save on the environment and so on. And there are also, of course, shifts in work and career preferences. In the UK, we've seen a big movement from engineering towards services. But also, industries sometimes, in a sense, wear out. The coal industry in the UK, for example, was a major employer back in the 1960s, 50s, 70s, and so on. And now it's a very small employer, and will probably soon be a non-employer, as people switched over to alternative sources of energy and to the desire to have different lifestyles as well. We also grade products and services differently. We look at products now in terms of quality, image, reputation, and maybe that's a big difference to at the end of the Second World War, when there was a real shortage of products and people just simply wanted to get their hands on a product, and the key determinant of the sale was the price. Now we've moved away from price to look at quality, attributes, design, reputation, desirability. So there's a shift in the way we as customers look at products as well. And these are all part of the socio-cultural issues associated with the competitive environment. There are also global issues, of course. There's an importance relating to global political events. These can create uncertainty for industry and for the consumers. If there's a lot of world tension, people become very defensive and they don't want to spend. They want to see how it's going to work out. And there's also perhaps a drive back to the more basics, making sure that they've got food and shelter and the very basics in terms of their motivations, got those sorted. So when global events are very tense, that can happen. And there's also problems about understanding global markets. We live in a globalized world. Communications is almost instantaneous around the world. Markets are very much integrated. What happens in Shanghai will affect the London market. They may not even have a lot of assets that they're sharing in terms of monetary investments, but the psychology of one market seems to affect the psychology of the other market. So we live in a world which is very integrated, and that could mean that failure in one particular part of the world, not necessarily in Shanghai, but in any part of the world, failure here in London could lead to an upset in Chicago or an upset in Paris or wherever. So there's an issue here of trying to understand and come to terms with the fact that we live in a global setting. On the other side, we've got the issues of newly industrialized countries. Many countries are coming along in terms of industrialization. If we look at what happened in England back in the 1600s, it was an agrarian economy. People worked on the land. They were farmers essentially. There were some trades, tinsmiths and undertakers perhaps, and innkeepers and so on. But the vast majority of the population were engaged in agriculture. Then came the Industrial Revolution, and people moved off the land into industry. And now what we see in the UK is a deindustrialization. People are coming out of industry and into services, into advertising, accountancy, law, tourism, the arts, and so on. So people are coming out of industry and into these occupations. But that leaves a gap. Industry can now go to other countries, which it has. So the newly industrialized countries are becoming those, and the UK has become more and more service orientated. Now it's likely to be the case that those other countries, the newly industrialized countries, will go through a similar course of development, and yet more countries, poorer countries, will industrialize. And many people see this as a good thing because it's spreading income generation and wealth throughout the world, giving other countries an opportunity. There are different cultural and institutional attributes that we can see in play throughout the world and that affect business. Not all countries do business in the same way. Everyone seems to understand the balance sheet and profit and loss and how the market seems to work. But there are different cultural factors in play which may influence the way in which we trade globally. Then, of course, we've got technology, which impacts on the competitive environment. We have product innovations, which are ongoing. If we look at the items we keep in the home, they have changed immensely over perhaps even just the last few years. Televisions are no longer just televisions. They are now media centers. They're they're smart televisions. They're able to get the internet, and they're able to send messages, and we're able to browse the web on the television. That's just televisions, but it applies to all the products in the home just about. It applies to cars. Cars once got us from A to B, proverbially from A to B. But now cars have sat-nav navigations, and they have telephone, and they have radio and entertainment, and it's much more than just a transport facility. We also have applications of knowledge. As education has developed, there's opportunities for students to be innovative, to come up with new products and new ideas, and get these developed and introduced. And on the other side, we have a focus of private and government-supported research and development expenditures. Sometimes governments and the private sector get together to develop products. Sometimes companies will get together as well to develop products that are perhaps very expensive. Airlines, for example, will have all sorts of inter-company arrangements and intra-arrangements throughout the various components of the companies themselves, all leading to research and development. Essentially, research and development is very expensive. It's trying to find something that is new. And this means that companies must spend a lot, and they may spend a lot and get nothing back. There's no guarantee research and development is going to throw up some great product. So it could be collaboration between government and the private sector, in particular for some areas like, for example, healthcare, where the government involvement can be justified as in the public interest, very much so. We also have new communications technologies, not just smartphones, but the internet, but all sorts of communications techniques that enable companies to communicate efficiently with personnel in the field. They're able to video conference, they're able to use instantaneous messaging, they're able to access databases and particular reports and support documentation. It's a different world. They're carrying their office on their phone perhaps, and that is radically new. There's also a legal and political component to the competitive environment. The government keeps an eye on the competitive environment to make sure it is competitive. The nature of capitalism is that companies should compete. That will drive down the price and ensure that the consumers get a good deal. But sometimes companies don't want to compete. They want to get together and share monopoly profits. So the government is constantly monitoring what's going on within different sectors of the economy to try and ensure that there is competition which is in the interest of the consumer. But the government must also have taxation laws. It tries to raise revenue for its own expenditure on, let's say, on merit goods like hospitals and schools, roads perhaps. It needs to raise this cash, and it does this by taxing industry, but it can also tax the workers and tax our expenditures. It must bear in mind that we live in a competitive world as well, and if it taxes, let's say, companies excessively, the companies may close down and move to another country where it's cheaper. They're free to do so. So the government has constraints in terms of what it can do. It might want to increase taxes, but it can't, because the companies will simply close and move, and that would mean the loss of employment and the loss of tax from the people who would have been working in those companies. It may also have a deregulation philosophy. For example, governments may have regulated markets uh, broadly because it felt that the markets needed regulation in the public interest. It may have, for example, issued licenses to companies to produce products which were in effect granting them monopoly status. In the past, in the UK, telephones, for example, were controlled by the post office. Then eventually it was deregulated and it was privatized. So it depends on the commitment that the government has towards different objectives, and its commitment to, let's say, having a free market may lead to deregulation. On the other side, we've got labour training laws. The government tries to ensure that the population is adequately trained and educated to participate in modern working practices. And educational philosophies and policies have to address the requirements of industry and commerce to ensure employability, and that students leaving education have an opportunity to embark on a world of work. There's also demographic factors which impact on the competitive environment. An aging population, for example, and the size of the population. Large populations can support larger markets. But also the age structure. As populations get older, the types of goods and services they require will change. There could also be a geographic distribution of the population. Sometimes populations may be congested into small areas. In the case of the UK, London is an obvious magnet for population. That's where people seem to live or want to live. But there are other parts of the UK which are sparsely populated. And there's also the ethnic mix, and also community relations within the ethnic mix. How well do people get along together, and how harmonious is the whole society? And of course, the income distribution. It's seen as important that the income distribution should be relatively well spread out. It's deemed not to be so fair to have perhaps just a few very rich people and the vast majority of the population very poor. A more sustainable society is one in which people feel they have a stake in the society and they can advance themselves. Now, the external environmental analysis, well, this should be a continuous process. It's important to continually monitor the external environment, and there are 4 parts to the process. For a start, scanning, watching and trying to identify emerging trends and changes in the environment. It's important for companies to try and watch the environment, see what's happening, try to understand what's happening, and see if it is significant in the context of what they're doing. Monitoring, systematically checking data and observations of the environment and its changes and trends. That's important to monitor what's happening, not just scan it to see if there's anything there, but to monitor it, to keep an eye on it, keep an eye on particular sectors and see what's happening, what are the changes. And try to forecast, use analytical techniques to make projections and of anticipated outcomes based on monitored changes and trends. So through the monitoring process, take the next step. The next step is to try to forecast the trend, to see if there are commercial opportunities that arise out of the forecasting, to see if they can spot a niche that perhaps is not fulfilled currently. And assessing, deciding on the accuracy of the forecasts and doing a detailed risk assessment. It's important to be critical of forecasts. They are just, and to some extent, just trends and trying to work out what's likely to happen. So there's a probability element associated. It's a little bit of perhaps statistics coupled with a little bit of guesswork. Well, that means it's got to be assessed and criticized and refined, and better approaches constantly sought. Now, Porter's five forces model, the model of competition. Well, we start with the threat of new entrants. So let's look at this. Just look at the threat of new entrants and see what we can work out from here. Well, for a start, the threat of new entrants and economies of scale. Economies due to size. It could be the size of the market that's growing, but normally we associate economies of scale with the size of organizations. Companies get bigger. And as they get bigger, they become more efficient. They're able to have specialist machinery, specialized managers, specialized processes. They're large organizations. They're able to negotiate good discounts with the banks, and they have power by virtue of their size. We also have product differentiation, which is an ongoing trend in the society. We like products to be different. We like them to be varied. We like innovation. We like change. Then there's the capital requirements of companies who want to set up in markets. It's not always easy to get the capital to set up, to start a new business. And indeed, existing companies may find it difficult to raise additional funds for growth. And there's switching costs. Trying to switch areas of focus within the company, trying to perhaps switch over from one type of activity to another, trying to make savings, and trying to look at the efficiency of the organization in total. And there's access to distribution channels. It's important that the companies have access to various distribution channels that will properly address their needs. And the cost disadvantages independent of scale. Well, there are cost disadvantages in the threat of new entrants and dealing with the threat of new entrants, because companies may have to diversify in order to stop new entrants, for example, coming in to a market. Diversifying means placing more products in front of the customers, thereby crowding out the market, leaving very little scope for new entrants to get in. But that's costly. It's taking the company into areas of expenditure that perhaps it didn't want to enter. Also looking at government policy. Government policy towards organizations and companies, and towards their rules for employing and training and remuneration and sick leave and maternity leave, paternity leave. Looking at all of the different policies the governments put in front of organizations that they must follow. And look at expected retaliation on the part of companies when something changes. When companies are in a competitive situation and they change their price, there may be retaliation. It's not a passive environment. It's a very dynamic environment, and business situations tend to be very fluid. If a company starts to invest in a new product or make changes, other companies will respond. They don't sit passively by. So when we consider the threat of new entrants, we can identify at least 8 different areas. You'll see in some notes, and I'm sure in some of your reading, perhaps more. Some of concertina these list down to maybe somewhat less. But these areas we can imagine as important in the context of new entrants. Economies of scale. Well, as new entrants, if they're thinking of coming in, they will have to get over the power of the existing companies who are in the market producing and have got a certain size and reputation in the market. So new entrants will have to take that on board. They'll have to look at the number of different products in the market and look at the capital they need to raise if they want to come in. see how they can become more efficient in terms of switching costs. How will they get access to distribution channels? The existing companies in the market may have sewn all of these up, may have exclusive agreements with distributors. Look at the cost disadvantages independent of scale, one separate from the scale one. The cost disadvantages in just trying to buy in raw materials, train the workforce, set up the whole organization. They're at a disadvantage from the start, and so on. So we've got these issues that need to be confronted by new entrants. Now, the bargaining power of suppliers. Well, suppliers are likely to be powerful. Suppliers are likely to be powerful, please note, if the supplier industry is dominated by a few firms. If there's a few firms in the industry that are supplying a product or a raw material, they tend to be quite strong. There's only a few of them, so they tend to be quite powerful. If they have few substitutes, if the product they're supplying doesn't have substitutes, again, the suppliers will be in a strong position to negotiate good terms from their customers. If the buyer is not an important customer to the supplier, if the buyer is seen as not an important customer, the supplier can then try to get a good deal with that buyer. If the supplier's product is an important input to the buyer's product, then the supplier will be in a strong position. The buyer must acquire that product, so the supplier has got a lot of bargaining power. Suppliers' products are differentiated. If that's the case, then the suppliers will also have a significant amount of power, because they offer different products. They're not just relying on one, so they have perhaps more power within the market, and they have perhaps dominated a particular line of products, related products, but because they are differentiated, the suppliers have a better control over that particular market or set of products within the market, and therefore they are more powerful. Suppliers' products have high switching costs. If it's the case that the buyers are using the products of the supplier and then wish to switch over to an alternative, and that involves a lot of cost, then the buyers may find that they are, in a sense, caught up with the product of the supplier. They can't find it easy to move. They must use that particular product. It could be, for example, their technology has become dependent on that particular product of the supplier. It's a component perhaps that they have to buy, and they can't easily switch over to an alternative, in which case the supplier has got a significant amount of power. And the supplier could pose credible threat of forward integration. It could be that the supplier will want to move in to making the product. The supplier, let's say, of raw materials might want to not just supply the raw materials, but go on to make the product itself, in which case the suppliers have considerable power over the existing companies in the market. The existing companies will want to, in a sense, be nice to the suppliers. They don't want them to enter, because if they do, the existing suppliers will, the existing companies in the market, I should say, will lose their source of supply for raw material. The company coming in who has forward integrated will now start to use the raw materials that it's supplying, that previously it supplied to its customers. Now it may supply to itself, in a sense, and produce the product itself. Now that will give the supplier considerable power in the market. Now, the bargaining power of buyers. Well, buyers compete with the supplying industry by trying to bargain down price. That's what the buyers try to do. They try to get the price as cheap as possible. So they're constantly trying to negotiate the prices downwards. They're also trying to force the suppliers to improve their quality. So it's not just bargaining down price, but perhaps trying to get better quality. Now, buyer groups are likely to be powerful if buyers are concentrated or purchase in large relative to sellers' sales. So if the buyers are concentrated, or if they're able to purchase in large amounts, then they have much more power. The sellers must pay attention to them. They're buying in a concentrated fashion. They're able to perhaps get together and do their buying, and in so doing negotiate discounts from the seller. Also, the products are undifferentiated. They're powerful if the products are undifferentiated. If the products are all the same, then the buyers will be likely to have more power, because they're able to focus in on the one product, they're able to negotiate discounts on the product, and they're able to deal with the seller about that product individually. There's no distractions with other products, related products. The market is quite straightforward. The chances are the buyers have more power in that situation. They'll also be powerful if they're able to switch between the output or the products of one seller to the products of another seller. If they're able to do that, if they're able to switch quite cheaply between one to the other, the buyers will have more power, because the sellers will feel the threat that they will lose that customer. So the sellers must treat the customers well, give them discounts and so on. If the buyer's industry earn low profits, then buyers groups may feel quite powerful. Ironically enough, they might feel more powerful because, in a sense, they've got very little to lose. They need to force down the price to try and increase their margins, and they put pressure on the sellers to do so. If the sellers don't do so, they'll have reduced profits. Their commitment to the product and to the market may be weakened. In fact, they may be looking around for alternatives, alternative businesses or alternative goods to make. Ironically, when the industry earns low profits, they may have more power. Buyers present a credible threat of backward integration. So if the buyers can move back and secure their own supplies, if that is possible, the buyers will be stronger. So if a buyer can move backwards and acquire the raw materials or acquire the components that it uses, thereby it's now producing its own, then the existing sellers will want to stop that from happening, and they'll want to treat the buyers better. So the buyers will have more power. If the product is unimportant to quality, then the buyers are likely to have more power. They're not negotiating with the sellers on terms of quality. They're negotiating in terms perhaps of price, and they're able to focus in on price because quality is not that important. It's difficult to imagine a product where this would apply, but if that was the case, the buyers would have more power. Obviously, the buyers, if they have full information, they'll have more power again. If they know what the cost of production for the product is, if they know the markups that the sellers are making, if they know what the suppliers are in terms of the total supply in the market, including the globalized market, then they're able in a better position to negotiate better terms from the seller. Now, the threat of substitute products. Well, products that may be substituted for each other are substitute products. It's as simple as that. Products with similar function limit the price firms can charge. So if the companies are engaged in production and engaged in a particular market, and the functions of their products are similar to the functions of other products, then there's limited scope to change the price, because the final consumer will be just interested in the functions of the product perhaps, and if they're focusing in on the functions, then the prices must be relatively the same, which will enable the customers to make decisions about functions and select on the basis of function. If the prices increase and they're making similar products in terms of function, the price increases, the customer will simply switch away from the higher priced product, focus in on the cheaper one, and it's got similar functions, so why go for the more expensive? There are lots of examples. Petrol and diesel. If the price of petrol is much more expensive than diesel, people will tend to switch over to diesel cars. Gas and electric heating. If electric heating is very expensive, people will switch over to gas fired heating. Private and public transport. Similar function, get you from A to B, maybe not in the same level of comfort, but A to B, and this means that if one increases in price, people may switch over to the other one. So now we have the Porter's Five Forces model. We have the four that feed in, and the central one, the rivalry amongst the competing firms in the industry. And let's talk about that particular fifth force, the rivalry amongst the competing firms in the industry. Intense rivalry may manifest itself in several ways: setting competitive prices whilst avoiding price wars. So they try to set competitive prices, but they don't want to spark off a price war. A price war is when they cut the price, the other companies match that price cut and perhaps cut it a bit more, causing the first one to come back and cut their price again. This is a price war, and price wars can be very destructive for the consumer as well. It sounds like the consumer is getting a good deal. There's a price war, the price is falling. But if the price war continues for a long time, some companies may go out of existence. They can't compete anymore. They can't survive. And if they go out of existence, then the consumers are going to have less companies from which to buy, which means the price may rise in the future. So price wars are not good for consumers. Rivalry may also manifest itself through innovative marketing campaigns. The companies try to outmaneuver each other in terms of smart advertising and marketing, and the way they present the products and the total services they're offering with the product: after sales service, contact with the customers, market research, the way they go about making the products. So this would also, it's also a basis for rivalry, how they can outcompete each other in the marketplace. There could be advertising battles where companies wage war through advertising, trying to put their product in front of the customer, the image of the product in front of the customer as often as possible. So it may lead to advertising battles where they're just trying to out-advertise each other. After sales service, as I just mentioned, is a good way of trying to compete, because the customer has contact with the producer, the customer feels that the producer cares, there's more loyalty on the part of the consumer, the consumer is more interested in the product and in the producer. But other companies will try to get in on this, and they may try to compete on that basis. There's also new product innovations, which are coming along all the time. And companies will have perhaps research and development departments, and also linking with the marketing department. The marketing department will link with consumer groups and try to find out what the consumer groups want and think about the product, feed this information back to the research and development, who will try to bring up new innovations. And that may be a basis for competition. Rivalry may be destructive, as I said. Price wars may damage the whole industry, so you've got to be careful about that one, the one I mentioned in number 1 above. And advertising battles may damage the smaller businesses. In fact, smaller businesses may not be able to engage in advertising battles. They can't afford it. Now, rivalry amongst existing competitors again. Well, cutthroat competition is more likely to occur when there are numerous or equally balanced competitors. By that I mean a large number of competitors, but competitors with similar size, similar capacities, and similar backgrounds and histories. In this case, they may really try to compete and once and for all try to beat each other, get them out of the market. So competition may be intense when there's a numerous number of competitors and they're all roughly around the same size. It's also intense when the industry is growing very slowly, so they're fighting for sales. In this case, they become very active in trying to gain customers and retain customers, so they put a lot of effort into this. When there's high fixed costs, they try to get sales as well, because they're spreading the fixed costs over a large volume of output, which reduces the average cost of the fixed assets. So they try to have large outputs if they've got high fixed costs. Also, if there's high storage costs, if they make products and they're starting to have to store the products, but the storage is expensive, to try again to move it as quickly as possible. Try to make it and sell it, rather than make it, store it, and then sell it. When there's a lack of differentiation or switching costs, when products are essentially the same, then there's intense rivalry. The companies are trying to differentiate the products. They're trying desperately to influence the customers in favor of their product, but essentially their product is the same as the rival's product. So there is intense competition trying to persuade the purchasers of perhaps psychological differences, image differences. It's the case also that if capacity has to be added in large increments, if they can't step up production without perhaps building a new factory or buying in new expensive machinery. So if they have to do that, then they're going to try and sell as many as possible to cover the cost of the additional capacity. And that will lead to more intense competition as well, as the other producers react to this. And I have to recognize that competitors are diverse. They are different, and their responses may be different. Some may have responses that are lagged slightly in time. Others may be more instantaneous. Others may respond differently. Perhaps one increases the amount it's trying to sell through marketing initiatives. The other company may respond by simply cutting the price if it can. So there's a whole diverse range of responses that competitors can take, and these diverse range of responses are in themselves a reflection of the diversity of the competitors. It's also the case that competitors may feel that they're locked in. They find it difficult to get out of the industry. They have specialist machinery that doesn't have a second-hand price. they have the premises, they're locked in, they have to continue. So they're desperate to make sales, therefore. So that will drive the intensity of the competition. Now, high exit barriers are economic, strategic, and emotional factors which cause companies to remain in an industry even when future profitability is questionable. So sometimes high exit barriers, I should say, are economic, they're strategic, and even emotional. Sometimes the owners of the business don't want to get out. It's their family business. They've always had it. They don't want to leave now. They want to fight on to the end. So that can lead to intense competition. They could have, as I said earlier, specialized assets. They find it difficult to dispose of those, so they can't get out. There could be a fixed cost of exit, trying to compensate labour and paying off labour in terms of redundancy payments and so on. That could be off-putting. They may not be able to afford to do that, and that's an issue that they have to look at. So rather than exit the industry and have to pay these fixed exit costs, they try to stay in. There could be strategic interrelationships. There can be strategic interrelationships between the producer, in this case, and let's say the suppliers. They have got agreements and links and arrangements that, in a sense, lock the two of them together. So they have to stay in the industry. They find it difficult to disentangle. They might have strategic relationships with outlets, or with advertising agencies, or with specialist producers who supply specialist components. So it's very difficult in that case just to get out. And as I said, there could be emotional barriers. It could be a family business that they simply don't want to dispose of it. It's always been in their family. This is what their family have done for generations, and they don't want to give up. So there's an emotional attachment. Or maybe it's just a business that they started themselves. They're interested in it all their lives. They were interested in this particular product or whatever. They started the business, and now they find it difficult to give it up. They're emotionally attached. And there could be government and social restrictions. The government may have problems about the company closing, in the sense that the company is an employer within the area, and the company will, and the government would be critical of the company if it didn't try to maintain itself and continue in existence, because it didn't want to lose the jobs in the local community. And indeed there could be local pressure on the business to continue, because the community want the business as a part of their infrastructure. They want the business to be there, not just as an employer, but because it somehow represents the image of that area. It's part and parcel of the way the local community see themselves. So there are issues they have to consider which are wider than just the internal factors. They have to look towards the wider, the pressure that the governments can bring to bear on the business to try and keep going. At the same time, the community will have an interest in the business as well. It's not just an economic interest. It could be related to, as I said, the image of the business as associated with that particular area. So exit barriers, if we compare those with entry barriers, well, if we have low exit barriers and low entry barriers, then we have low and stable returns. So the business is making a profit. It's running along, but it's running along at a low level. It's quite stable. It's easy for the company to get out of the business, and it's easy for other companies to come in. So it's existing. If the exit barriers are high, but it's easy for companies to come in, then the returns are very risky, because the producers in the market don't know how many new companies are going to come in, and they then themselves find it difficult to leave. So the returns are risky. Now, if the entry barriers are high and the exit barriers are low, companies can just get out of the market easily, then there are going to be high returns here. And it's quite stable as well. So high returns, because it's difficult for new companies to come in. So it's difficult for the company to have new competitors, but it's easy for the company to get out of the business if it so chooses. Therefore, the returns on its assets will be quite high. And the final one is when we have high entry barriers and high exit barriers. Well, high exit barriers and high entry barriers means few companies coming in to the market, but at the same time difficult to get out of the market. So it's high returns, generally speaking, but risky. Risky because if the market turns against the product, if the consumers turn against the product, they would find it difficult to get out. So it's risky. So that little schema helps us to look at entry barriers against exit barriers and what's likely to happen. Now, competitor analysis. Well, assumptions about competitor behavior. The current strategy. Determine the current competitor strategy. Try to work out what are the competitors doing. Well, what's their current strategy? What are they up to? So try to gain some insight into their strategy, their pricing, their innovation, the way they're marketing the product. Try to get as much information about competitors as possible, because this is an indication of the way in which the market is likely to develop. The market will have to accommodate the different competitors and the different strategies of the competitors, and the individual producer within the market will have to be aware of what his or her competitors are doing and adopt strategies to counter these as required. Look at the future objectives. A comparison of the set business objectives compared with those of the competitors. So the company should look at itself. It should look at what it's trying to achieve, what are its objectives, look at its corporate strategy, look at the objectives it's derived from its corporate strategy in terms of its operational and its marketing, its employment, and so on. Look at all of the various objectives it's got. These may be operational, clustered under one big objective, which is in turn related to its strategic plan. And then compare that, if possible, to the competitors and look for variations and try to understand why there are variations. Maybe the competitors know something that the company doesn't know. Maybe they have conducted research and they understand something, and that's taking them down a different road, a different path. And it's important for the business to understand that. And finally, look at the capabilities. Compare the ability of the business to compete in the market. Look at its ability in terms of the skills and competencies of its workforce. Look at its technology. Look at the age profile of its technology. Look at its distribution channels. Look at its reputation in the market. Look at its soft processes and the way it looks at marketing and its relationship with the customers. Look at its outlets and how it gets the product to market. Look at its capability for change, how it can accommodate changes to its strategic requirements. How can it go about this? And again, perhaps look at the competitors and see what they're doing. And also try to gauge their significance in the market, try to gauge their size, try to gauge their approach to the market. So in this video we've talked about many different and important issues associated with strategic management. It's a complicated video, it's a long video as you can see. It's well worth going over this several times, stopping and having breaks as you go through, making your own notes and understanding each different component part. It's a very important way of looking at, or introduction to, strategic management, way of looking at strategic management, or just introducing the various key topics that need to be considered. But that's all we're going to deal with, so let's leave it at that and say thank you for watching.